to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOP LP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube station at ncmhub.org. This morning, historian Anthony Guerriero is here to talk about the legacy of best-selling author and award-winning American historian David McCullough, who died at the age of 89 in 2022 at his home in Hingham, Massachusetts. Anthony's a favorite and a frequent guest on the show in the past. He's done me the favor of shining a light on the achievements, motives, and minds of prominent figures throughout American history, ranging from Thomas Jefferson and Ted Williams of Anthony's beloved Red Sox to World War II spy Mo Berg. And he's here this morning to talk about David McCullough. So, Anthony, first of all, thank you so much for taking time to visit us again and to talk about McCullough this morning.
Well, Mary, it's always good to see you. You look great. And thank you, as always, for the opportunity to indulge my passion.
Well, you make your passions fascinating
Thank
for
you.
everyone, Anthony, so thank you for that. So let's dig in. Anthony, in your opinion, what sets David McCullough apart from other historians?
Mary, that's a great question. And I just want to, if you can indulge me, let me just start by this, okay? So in Chapter 5, Section 2 of the Mass State Constitution, it says, the encouragement of literature, etc. Unusual this language, wisdom and knowledge and well virtue. But at the very end, it says, and calculate the principles of humanity and general benevolence, public and private charity, industry and frugality, honesty and punctuality in their dealings, sincerity, good humor. Now, that's unique.
Yeah.
Now, the Massachusetts Constitution was written by John Adams, right?
Okay.
A topic that we know with Mr. McCullough. And the Mass Constitution was the basis, the boilerplate, for the United States Constitution. And when David McCullough, I had the pleasure of seeing him multiple times. He came to the General Court, the State House, probably about 2001, after Adams had been published. And he spoke to members of the House and the Senate, and I was in the audience. And he started his talk, identifying the Constitution in this one aspect. And he reiterated it multiple, just good humor. And only a student of history who's passionate would identify that. So it was a unique beginning. And to answer your question, it's a loaded question, but a great question. He is, we've had a gold medal roster of historians in Massachusetts. We're really blessed. Dorrance Kearns Goodwin, author of the Kennedy Fitzgeralds and Team Rivals from Concord. Nathaniel Philbrick, Mayflower, and In the Heart of the Sea from Nantucket. Stephen Pulio, a local author out of Boston, The Molasses Flood, and of course my favorite, Italians of Boston. But, and I've enjoyed all those books, and I've used them when I was teaching. But, I'm a fan of McCullough's, right? My wife characterized me as a fanboy. And, when he would ask people, how do you know him? Do you know me from TV or from the books? It's, I knew him more from TV, from the American experience. But his cadence and his passion and his conversation to the camera and in his writing, and in the Great Bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge book that he wrote, which is terrific, which was my favorite book, I can feel the humidity when the men are working down, in the water, building the caissons and whatnot. I can hear my ears pop because they're below water. When he talks about the Battle of Bunker Hill, I can hear the muskets, and I can feel the heat and just taste the air. So, he just puts you in that moment. And he said that he wanted to move the reader like he would like to be moved. So that's, I think that for me sets him apart. And just the way he went about his writing, and you can tell there was a passion and the easiness of reading his work. Back to the Brooklyn Bridge, it's a living monument. And that's how he presents it.
Well, it's a distinct talent, isn't it? Because certainly not every historian is able to put you in the situation from the past and make you feel as though you're experiencing it as if you were time traveling back.
That's right.
And so that's a remarkable gift that he had. And it sounds as though from what you're describing, it was driven by his own ability to experience, to empathize, to identify
That's right.
with the people who were going through the experiences, but also to vividly portray what was going on,
Right.
what the environment, what it's like to be under the
right.
surface of the water. And so it's a remarkable gift. And I do remember his voice. I think even people who may not be familiar with his books would recognize his voice.
Yes.
Whether they would, you'd hear it and you'd go, that voice is familiar. It's been in many documentaries, because it was a very distinctive, I just find it kind of a reassuring voice, I have to say.
Grandfatherly.
Yes,
Right?
there you go.
I mean, I could
Yes.
see him at the front of the fireplace and just sitting down there. But, you know, for him, he was such an inspiration for me, particularly as a 28-year-old,
Yeah.
recent graduate from graduate school, beginning a teaching career at Salem State for 14 years in
Yeah.
American history. And, you know, he would say that, you know, history wasn't just about military events and dates and money, okay?
Yeah.
And I quote, "It's about cause and effect, consequences, life, poetry," which I love, music, the mystery of time, science, drama, love, and the mystery of human nature. And in his writing, he says that he's interested in the human story.
Yeah.
So when you hear that, and for me in particular, I was like, you know, you're right. So let me encompass these things. When I'm talking about the early '60s, it's just not about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's about the Beatles, right?
That's right.
And when I was, introducing history to my students, and I said, like, who watched the final out of the Boston Red Sox winning their first World Series in 86 years? And all of them raised their hands and said, you watched a historic moment. So
Yes.
history is all-encompassing, and that's something I really got from McCullough.
And the implication of that is that we are all history makers.
Yeah.
And I think often the way history, in some versions of how it's taught, I'll speak personally how I was taught, often we're remote observers.
That's right.
Of mostly battles.
That's right.
And so I think it's an enormous surface to everyone to make us all feel as though we're constantly engaged
That's right.
in making history. Everything depends upon the moment. So I think that's a real gift.
Yeah, I think it is. And, the way I taught was I always felt that my students did best if they got out of the classroom. You learn by doing.
Uh-huh.
And he put you into that situation, whether it's you're watching the wreckage of the homes floating by from the Johnston flood, or, you're traveling with John Adams on a horse during the winter and seeing the horrors of the Boston Massacre. And, and when you teach history can be very bland.
Yeah.
And it can be very challenging to stay awake and listen. And that's depending on the material and the instructor.
Yeah.
Right? And to our point, when you're listening to David McCullough, it's like you listen to a grandfather.
Yeah.
And you could just tell that he enjoyed the material. He enjoyed the material.
Yeah. Well, tell us about, I know you mentioned encountering David McCullough at the State House,
Yeah.
but did you meet him personally and interact with him?
Briefly, yeah. So I had the great fortune of meeting him 3 times.
Wow, okay.
So I met him at Salem State right after he won the Pulitzer for Truman. He did a speech. And then I mentioned that he was at the State House.
Yeah.
So I saw him at the State House and then back again at Salem State when he came out and spoke at doing the tour on Adams. So I was very fortunate because I had 3 books, and I had him sign 2 copies of Adams and 1 copy of Truman, and then my prized possessions, because on one of the copies, I told him about he inspired me and all that, and that he says, to Anthony, fellow historian.
Oh.
So,
Okay.
that is a prized possession of mine.
Absolutely.
And I have a picture of him with me as a younger man on the wall downstairs. I call it the Wall of Fame at my home. And, his point regarding the identifying that one part of the Massachusetts Constitution. Right?
Yeah.
It wasn't bearing arms or collecting taxes,
Yeah.
but good humor. Only
Right.
a person with him who has that keen
Right.
eye would identify that. And he was just personable, and what you see is what you got. And he was just he enjoyed interacting with people.
Yeah.
He was interested in you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, nice to meet you. What's your name? Anthony? Okay, where do you work? I work at the State House, and I teach part-time at Salem State. And oh, that's great. And what do you teach? American history.
Fellow historian.
And you've done, you've been a big inspiration on, and I utilize your work. And you see that. I mean, HBO did a great documentary on him back in '08 called Painting with Words, and which is actually his wife quoted. And you could see him when he's out there, and his children would say it. He likes talking to people because he's interested in the human story. He always did. He just happens to study people in the past.
Well, from his point of view, talking to people is gathering history.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and see how they might think about something in particular, because we're all different.
Well, Anthony, you mentioned your favorite book, The Brooklyn Bridge, but tell us more about what makes that book, of all the books, because he wrote a lot of them, what makes that book your favorite?
So, when I was in college and then in graduate school, my focus was preliminary, colonial America, right? So that was my study in living here on the North Shore. That was really the area that I focused on, and I love Adams. It's a terrific read. But the Brooklyn Bridge, I think it's because of the majesty of it, built by immigrants, so there was no safety measures, no OSHA. So if you got hurt in the job, or you died on the job, that's it. Goodbye. I mean, we're going to get the next person in line. But it was a monumental task to build this. And as he would say, that it was the entryway into New York. So you'd see the Statue of Liberty, but you'd also see the Brooklyn Bridge. And it was something that it was about possibility, that this is what America is about. We can do it. It's going to be tough, but we can build this and watch how we do it. And it seems to parlay into The Path Between the Seas, which is his book about the Panama Canal. But, he always was fascinated. He lived in New York, and he would always go with his family, or whenever he went back to New York, he would go to the Brooklyn Bridge, just to, you can walk on the promenade up there and whatnot, and just get that flavor. And he brought a structure of steel, concrete, and granite and cables to life. So the reader has ownership.
Interesting.
Into the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, right? So you're beginning this journey and this idea that we need to do this, and at the end you have this wonderful gift like Christmas Day, and you sit back and you're thinking about all the people, like the Robeson family that was involved, and how it had to be designed, and how this was state of the art. And this was really, in McCullough's word, a moonshot. This was really something that was going to be unique and different. And for those people that were coming into this country by boat back in the day, you see the great Statue of Liberty, but then you see in the distance this magnificent piece of architecture, and you're like, you can't just be, you're wowed by it. You sit back and say, wow, this is what the United States is all about. And it just sits with you, and that's, you take ownership, and it's a magnificent read. He authored that in '72, and it's just a great book.
Well, it makes me want to go.
Yeah, I want to go back. Yeah,
because it sounds as though he managed through artful and deep storytelling about the bridge to transform it into a living symbol of so many of the things that are the source of America's strength and hope, as you describe it.
Well said.
The immigrants who built it, the ambition to create this, for its day, this, kind of moonshot, kind of let's do this.
That's right.
And of course, the fact that it's literally a bridge is also symbolic on its own terms.
That's right.
So that is really masterful storytelling.
Yes.
As well as artful history making.
Yes.
So it's no wonder he was a best-selling author.
Yeah, and Mary,
as well.
I read it 10 years ago during the 40th anniversary republishing of it, and the way I described it, you would think I just read it yesterday.
Yes, absolutely.
So, I mean, 10 years later, it's still with me.
The way you describe it makes me feel as though I'm with you and we're looking at it and
Yeah.
going, wow.
And it's interesting. I had shared with you that I got a nice note from Mr. McCullough's son, Jeff,
Yes, yeah.
who's one of his 5 children, and he reached out to me and really made my year. And we had a nice chat yesterday, and he said that was his favorite book too.
Interesting. And did he say why?
Well, he just said that, I think a lot of the things that I just conveyed to you, but also he wrote that with little kids in the house.
Oh, gosh, okay.
So, he's not just an author, he's a parent.
Yeah.
And still made this magnificent work of art while still dealing with everything that is being a husband and a parent and an author.
Yeah.
So.
Well, since we were talking about McCullough's family, I know
Yep.
we were also talking a bit before we started the show about some really interesting observations you had about his marriage and the
Yes.
partnership. So I think that was really interesting. Could you repeat that?
So, in preparation for this, and I think that, when I first broached the topic with you about a couple of months ago, and this thinking leading up to this, right? You're always noodling, using your word. I think, for me, the David McCullough story is really a love story. Mm-hmm. And it's 2 parts, right? There's the love of the material.
Yeah.
And he really did. When he talks about the Johnstown flood, and he was a Pittsburgh neighbor, he grew up a native, and this happened just about very close to him. He didn't know much about it. He wanted to learn more, and he didn't like what he read. So he said, let me write the book that I would like to read. And you could tell when he talks about his topics, or he talks about history and people, he loves the material. But on every video I've watched, when he's come to, I had the opportunity, like I said, to see him 3 times, he always recognizes his wife, Rosalie. Now, they met when they were very young, and he says, he goes, I knew right away, this is the woman that I want to marry. And, for all intents and purposes, everything that you see, just lovely, right? And it was a partnership. And I just want to get to that because it's interesting. He says in Adams, okay, and this is on page 57. His, being John Adams, marriage to Abigail Smith was the most important decision of John Adams' life.
Interesting.
As would become apparent with time. She was in all respects his equal, and the part she was to play would be greater than he could possibly have imagined. For all his love for her and what appreciation he already had for her beneficial, steadying influence. And I don't know the McCullough family, but that sounds pretty much how he would describe his wife.
Oh,
And, Mary, we make 1,000 decisions a day.
we do.
Okay? And as I know, the most important decision I ever made was I married the right woman. Okay? And think about this. Here's David McCullough, who's had a very good career. He's worked at the U.S. Information Center. He's worked as an editor and writer at American Heritage. He has a good job. He has a nice house. And then he makes this decision. I think I want to write. Because he studied English literature, right, at Yale. I think I want to write. I think I can be good at it. And she supported him.
Yeah.
And when you write, and I've written very, very, very minuscule stuff, right? But the best advice I got when I chose my master's thesis is that choose a subject you love because you're going to marry it.
Okay.
And for 18 months, I was all Jackie Robinson.
Yeah.
That's all I thought about was Jackie Robinson and how to tell a story. So just imagine, that was just the little master's thesis over an 18-month period. You're writing a book that's going to take you several years to complete, and you're going to do revision. And they had a growing family, right? And you're worrying about paying attention to your spouse, paying attention to your kids, whatever, raising a child is very challenging. And then the bills come due, and what you got to do to support that. And she supported him, and he was in 100% completely. And that's the love story, right? And she was his partner. And he always said that, he always introduced her, and she said that she was the captain of the ship, and she was Secretary of the Treasury. he would give her the pages and they would read it. He always said that, I think that it's best to hear it out because then you're going to identify this doesn't sound right or we got to change this. And that was a great partnership. And it's no surprise, they died several months apart.
Did they? Okay.
She died in June and then he died a couple of months later. And I think that at the end, I think it's a love story. One is the love for the material.
Yes.
Because that comes out in his writing and his talks. And the love for his family and his family and his wife. He had 5 great kids who were successful in their own right. They're, from my conversation with Jeff yesterday, they were family people. Was sitting at the dinner table all the time and talking about, he would say what he's working on, and they would, what are you doing, how's school and whatnot, and that was so important to them.
Yeah. Well, it is a double love story as you describe it, and it's also a story of courage because it takes courage to make a change like the one you described.
Yes.
Driven by love of what you are pretty sure you want to do, and faith that you can make a go of it, but also faith in the love of your partner and your family, that you'll get the support there. And as he so clearly, keenly appreciated, that's part of what makes it possible, as is true, as he put with John Adams. So anyway, it's interesting to think about all those choices that we make every day, as you say, some of which are more consequential than others, but among the most consequential is whom we include in our lives.
Yeah, because she supports you, and the marriages fluctuate and they have the ups and downs. But I think the term that you use is the term I wanted to use is courage. I remember in one of the documentaries on the American Experience, he talked about immigrants and how we talk about courage in so many forms. But when you're an immigrant, you come to a country, and some of these immigrants are illiterate in their own language, to a brave new world. And the courage it took those two adults with a growing family to say, you know what, everything that we have, we're going to give it, we have faith in each other, we support each other, going to give it out the chance, I know I can do this. Yeah. So that means we're going to downsize and we're going to move to chase this passion and chase this dream, and that's real courage.
Yeah. Well, Anthony, I was looking at a list of the topics of his books in preparation for this, and it's really diverse. We've just been referenced a few of them, from John Adams to the Brooklyn Bridge, but he also wrote about Teddy Roosevelt, the Wright brothers, and clearly, I think a link must have been that these were topics or people that he fell in love with. But do you see a thread that connects what McCullough was drawn to write about in this tremendous diversity of topics that he covered? Well,
there's definitely a connection. It's the human story. He talks about that Roosevelt family took a look at the destruction of the Johnstown flood, and they're the family that built the Brooklyn Bridge. So there's that connection. I think that the Panama Canal was built under Teddy Roosevelt's administration.
Okay.
So there's that connection. Teddy Roosevelt went to Harvard, just like John Adams. Okay? So I think that there is definitely that connection. And think about it. He took 2 U.S. presidents who, in all intents and purposes, when you talk about the top 10, they're not even in the discussion for the top 20. They're obscure. And then he brought them to life and said, listen, these guys are just as important. And he was upset about Adams. He says, there's no monument to him down here in Washington, D.C. There's no talk about him. He says, he's not on a currency. He's not on a postage stamp. Why is that? And he made you have compassion for someone that didn't exist before. And, I remember specifically, he was the narrator for TR on the American Experience in PBS, which that entire presidential series was great. And I remember his discussion about that Theodore Roosevelt, even though he was boisterous and athletic, he wasn't that way as a little boy. He was very sickly, and it's well known now he was asthmatic. And McCullough would come out and say, his father, who was his idol, being Roosevelt's idol, he'd have these bad attacks. So he would wake up young Theodore, or Theodore Jr., and walk him in the streets of New York, because Teddy didn't think he was going to wake up the next day. They didn't have the medicine and the inhaler. And as a parent of a child with asthma, And being through that and the hospitalizations and the sickness, I recall that. And McCullough makes it that Theodore Sr., his sensitivity to his son and what he did, and because Theodore would always say that my father was the greatest man I ever met, and just thinking about that, not trying to emulate it, but just thinking about that and having that play in my head, and I can hear McCullough's narration about that process, about waking up young Theodore and saying you have to build yourself, and everything's going to be all right.
Yeah, so the threading link is the fascination with the human experience.
I think so.
And the ability to see within these historical figures the living, breathing human being that we can all empathize and identify with. Any parent can identify with having an ill child.
That's great.
And we can be inspired then by what McCullough points out, which is the devotion to nurturing and helping and assisting. And so it's always about, as you put it, the human experience. And it humanizes all of us then to be able to share as many of those experiences as we can.
At one of his talks, he says, what is history? And his response is, the lessons of history are manifold. Nothing happens in isolation. Everything that happens has consequences. We're all part of a larger stream of events, past, present, and future. To a large degree, history is a lesson in proportions. A sense of history is an antidote to self-pity and self-importance, of which there is too much in our time. History reminds us that nothing counterfeit has staying power. History teaches us that character counts. Character above all.
I take a deep breath.
Right. And
so
that's
well put.
Very well put.
Yeah.
And I think that, as you mentioned, the people that I've spoken about, and primarily with the history towards baseball, I mean, these are the characters that we study over and over and over again, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
And, with all their little picadillos and their problems and their warts, those are the people that last. And think about the men and women that he's discussed. I mean, he wrote about the Wright brothers and, Roosevelt, that no one knows anything about, and their influence in the Brooklyn Bridge. And it's just so well said. And it's something it's something that I use in my teaching and think about, when I do my talks around the Commonwealth on my topics.
Well, you just cited a passage from McCullough that beautifully summarizes the value and the magnificent potential impact that history can have on all of us. And that leads me to something that I really was wanting to ask you about, and you said it was okay. Because, we've all been learning about the effort in certain parts of the United States to censor history, to somehow see a true and honest, fulsome recounting of history is dangerous because it might make some people uncomfortable, because there are chapters of American history that are brutal, savage, full of injustice, and these efforts to particularly seems to target the history of slavery and the history of systemic and ongoing racism in this country. And so I wanted to ask you, what do you think McCullough would have made, or how would he have responded to these, what I find to be very, very troubling efforts to control how history is taught?
That's a loaded question, Mary, and I don't want to get in trouble. So
you won't get in trouble here.
So Gore Vidal, another historian, accurately said that we're the United States of amnesia. We don't remember what happened yesterday, and McCullough agreed with that.
Yeah.
And when I'm going to quote him. And when he accepted the 1995 Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters, he said, and again I quote, "We in our time are raising a new generation of Americans who, to an alarming degree, are historically illiterate. The American past is slipping away, out of sight and out of mind. We're losing our story." And he's right. He's right. Nationwide, history majors are way down because no one wants to study it. And I think it goes back to what we said at the beginning of this program, how it's taught. And, it's more than just dates. I think that his concern would be knowing history's in proportions and history has consequences. When you take that negative stuff out, then you don't have a true picture. He would look at that and say, I find that troubling. Okay? I came here and talked about Thomas Jefferson, the foodie.
Yes.
Our first conversation,
Right.
his influence in American cuisine. When I speak about Jefferson, and I'm a big Jefferson guy, okay? However, when I talk about him, I acknowledge that, yeah, he wrote that all men are created equal, but he only meant a certain group of men.
Right.
And he's the only founding father that didn't release his slaves upon his death.
Right.
So you're dealing with the yin and the yang, and you
Yeah.
have to acknowledge it. If I don't acknowledge it, then I'm a fraud.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that personally and professionally, as a student of history, who's taught it, who's researched it, and wrote about it,
Mm-hmm.
it's troubling.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was in grad school and I was finishing up my degree, we had some young students. He said, well, I'm tired of hearing about happy American history. I said, what do you mean about happy history? Because the influenza plague wasn't happy American history.
Yeah.
The molasses flood where people died and horses were stuck in molasses.
Yeah.
World War II, World War I.
Right.
I don't know what that means.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Anthony Guerriero speaking,
Mm-hmm.
it's troubling.
Mm-hmm.
Because, for example, this big debate about Faneuil Hall and the money where
Mm-hmm.
Peter Faneuil got
Mm-hmm.
from the slave trade.
Yeah.
My opinion, if I was asked, don't change the name. Put a display out,
Yeah.
okay? Have statues of people who are on the slave block. So
Yeah.
people recognize, okay, this is Faneuil Hall. He was an important person in the history of Boston,
Yeah.
in maritime trade and so forth, but he also owned slaves. McCullough made it very clear. No one was infallible.
Mm-hmm.
When we study and tell stories, because he's a storyteller, and that's what teachers are, we put everyone on a pedestal.
Mm-hmm.
He recognized, warts and all, that no one is infallible.
Yeah.
No one is infallible.
Yeah.
And people say, well, why isn't Adams well known? Well, he was stout, he was loud, he was opinionated. Not very well liked. He was a Yankee.
Mm-hmm.
And those traits of a Bostonian.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for me, I've been able to use my history background. I've been in the public sector for 30 years now, and it's allowed me to use that sense of history in doing projects in the area that I work
Mm-hmm.
that highlights the history of that particular area.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I know the history, so that's important. And that's kind of forgotten. People
Yeah.
just roll their eyes. And, they can get online and see something, but that even online isn't always accurate.
Yeah. And I think the growth of the whole development of the field of public history, bringing much more attention to local history.
Right.
Just because it's local doesn't mean it's not important. Doesn't mean it didn't have an impact that can be quite broad. And so, I knew you'd have interesting things to say about this, and I'm glad you talked about it the way you did. To me, it seems that I have a background as a psychotherapist, and this. So I think of this effort to censor history as repression, as the
Yes.
defense mechanism as repression. And what happens to repression, as Freud said, it returns.
That's right.
The return of the repressed is never pretty. I added that, but it's true, and it creates. I think it creates something of a trance state for people. I mean that literally. I think people go into a fog because we need to know our history. We need to know what people are, and no one's perfect. And I think if we falsely idealize or romanticize somebody and insist upon that, we lose the opportunity to become wise about human nature.
Yeah. And this, what's happened over the last several years, particularly the last decade with the falsehoods, this is the old saying, the bigger the lie, the more people are going to believe it.
Yes,
And
and the more often you repeat it, just
Yeah.
repetition alone, which has been a revelation to me to see that is just how that works.
Yes, and you would think that in the 21st century, after everything that we've witnessed
Yeah,
in a lifetime, it's troubling.
it is troubling. But we endure.
That's right.
And we look for the human story in history so that we can learn from it.
Yes.
And as you have so beautifully articulated,
Thank you.
and I think the story of Anthony Guerriero and David McCullough is also a love story.
My wife characterized me, and she said this to him when he was autographing my book. She goes, my husband is a fanboy, so that's how I've been described as a fanboy of David McCullough.
And I'm glad you are, because it's been so much fun and so illuminating
Thank you.
to talk to you this morning.
Thanks, Mary.
And I so appreciate your sharing the people that you're fanboys of with me. It's always fun, and I always learn a lot. One final question as we close, and it just occurs to me that As we've been saying, McCullough had a broad vision, a kind of a passion for history, and could find history everywhere. But I'm curious about, is there something that's gone on recently, and recently for an historian could be fast 50 years, that you wish he were alive to write about now?
Oh, that's a great question. It's definitely not going to be about the 2023 Red Sox.
No,
definitely not
sorry, Anthony.
Definitely not going to. That might be in
Sorry.
my book. That's really great. I think that, there's a lot of debate about what, the current presidential administration has done in terms of the money that's out there and the cost or whatnot. I think that he might take a look at that, and as a student of history, compare that to what happened during the Great Depression.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
So jump-starting the economy. We talked about, you mentioned the CCC when I came back here
Yes.
last time and talked
Yeah.
about that, and how that jumped the economy. And where, all this investment, the pros and cons to it. And what does that do? And the American feeling, because, we're more divided today than we ever have been. Maybe it's close to the Civil War. But McCullough said this. He says, American history, we have great times, and then, we're going to sink to the bottom of the earth. Mm-hmm. So, but Americans are optimistic, and change always is difficult, for better or for worse. So I think that he might, he could do some type of comparison there in terms of a person to study. In the last 40 years, I don't know. I mean, if there was an individual to choose. He said he liked going and living in the 17th century. He loved that period of time. He really enjoyed it. There was a church in Philadelphia that he, Adams went to the cupola up top, and he did the same thing, and he's like, I'm sitting on the stairs. So he liked that, but he did say if I was a time traveler, I'd just go for a short period of time. I like the time I live in. But, he did say in that documentary on HBO, he said, he had, a laundry list of books that he wanted to write that he knew that he wasn't going to be able to do. So it'd be interesting to see that notepad and see if there was a person that he was going to choose and say, hey, what do you think about that?
Absolutely.
But I think back to your point and my point, I think, he'd be happy that we all, read his books and all that, but he'd be concerned about the lack of understanding of history and how it plays a role.
But that's part of the impact of his life's work, is that his history appealed to people and was very popular, as well as well respected and also well read.
And a large impact on me. And I'm just one person. I'm just one little guy. And just, if I feel this strongly about him. And I think that's why I wanted to talk to him about it, because, he passed away. And I know it was, we were recovering from COVID last year, but I just felt that the attention, there needed to be greater attention because he's one of the great storytellers of our time.
Absolutely.
So thank you, Mary.
Well, thank you, Anthony. Always fun to talk to you. And, when you were just talking about Americans being optimistic, given our conversation, I started picturing the Brooklyn Bridge. So, anyway, Anthony, so much fun. Thank you so much.
Thank
it's
you,
always
Mary.
a joy to talk to you. I can't wait to find out what your next enthusiasm is.
Thanks, Mary. Always good to talk to you.
All right, take care now. That's it for today, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Till then, be well, read some David McCullough. Bye-bye.